And so I really wanted to say, let's just for a moment inhabit this woman's world and her experience and allow her to have a voice.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. So this is it, the last podcast of the first season. This is the 23rd regular bi-weekly episode of Lesche. And on top of that, there have been 3 bonus episodes on topics a little outside the podcast's regular lane. Doing this podcast this past year has been rewarding, sometimes in ways I never could have predicted. But it's also been tiring, pretty much in just the ways that I was expecting. So I will be taking a break for August. The second season is going to start with a brand new episode on Wednesday, September 10th. But let's live in the present here. I'm very excited about this episode, a conversation with academic and novelist Emily Hauser about her newest book, Penelope's Bones, a new history of Homer's world through the women written out of it, aka Mythica, as it is titled in the UK. I've actually been reading a lot about the Bronze Age lately, especially the so-called 12th century Bronze Age collapse, now made much more famous by Cline in his suite of 1177 books. So I was doubly excited to talk to Emily, whose book refocuses discussions of the period on women, both the female characters of the Homeric poems, which loosely depict the late Bronze Age, and the contemporary women whose work, whether as scientists, archaeologists, or authors, has been shedding new light on women's lives in antiquity. Emily, of course, is no stranger to this world. Her popular Golden Apple trilogy of novels, all retellings of Greek mythology, is set in it. What's different about Penelope's Bones, though, is the way that she interweaves fiction and nonfiction, the Homeric poems and late Bronze Age archaeology, and science and storytelling to paint a wonderfully vibrant and detailed picture. It is a picture that highlights the variety of contributions that women made to the Homeric poems and have made to our understanding of the societies that they depict. Let me just add quickly that if you enjoy this episode and are into this kind of material, I would definitely encourage you to go back and give a listen to Lesche episode 10, Wedding Poetics in Early Greek Literature, with Andromache Karonika. And there we discuss Andromache's work on how traces of women's song are actually evident in Homeric poetry. Emily Hauser is senior lecturer in classics and ancient history at the University of Exeter and the Times bestselling author of Mythica, a new history of Homer's world through the women written out of it, also known as Penelope's Bones in the U.S. She also wrote a trilogy of novels reworking the women of Greek myth, including For the Most Beautiful, which was published in 2016. She has a PhD in classics from Yale and was junior fellow at Harvard before returning to the UK. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. And once again, thank you so much for listening to this first season of Lesche. We'll be back with a new episode and a new season on Wednesday, September 10th. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Emily Hauser. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
It started really with a single sentence where I wrote down a sentence which was, there has been no better time to be a woman in Homer. And that kind of provoked, because I was thinking of this more along the lines of reception. I was at that point writing something about the reception of Homeric women. And I suddenly thought, this is really interesting as a question that pushes us back also into thinking about what does it mean to be a woman in Homer? How do we read these women? And really trying to come up with and confront that paradox of the fact that the women in Homer are so important and so powerful, and yet at the same time so sidelined. And I think trying to think through, why is now the time to do this work? And how can we use new ways of thinking, new ways of knowing, new ways of asking questions, and also sort of technologies, DNA, archaeology, but more broadly, the kinds of questions we're asking now about history and about whose voice gets to be heard. how does that change how we read Homer's women? And I think it was that process of realizing that this question that I think I had always approached as a literary one, as a philologist, or as a historical one, if you're thinking about the historical context, was actually one that was a dialogue between now and then. And that opened up for me the path, the way in.
How did you come to decide on the structure of the book, which you've arranged around these chapter headings where you take a character from Homer and assign to her a primary role? So I'm looking at, for example, Thetis as mother or Cassandra as prophet.
Yeah, I was interested in, this sort of the dialogic structure that I kind of talked about, where we've got modern concerns and ancient women kind of flowing together into each other, was part of what I wanted this to be. So I didn't want, because this is about trying to let the women lead the way into the story, and particularly the history and the ways that we are reading history anew to be the starting point, rather than kind of always starting with Homer and then going out from there. I wanted the women to be the guides. And so what I did was to look through, reading through, kind of sifting through late Bronze Age history, looking at the roles that women were playing, the ways that women were being used, for example, as goddesses, and the roles they were playing within society, within families. And then what I did was I then mapped that onto the different women within Homer and thought, well, how can we take what we know now about these roles that women are playing in late Bronze Age society, and how does that make us read the women in Homer differently? So it was a case of, for instance, you picked out Thetis as the mother. Motherhood is something which we see quite literally written into the bones of women in the late Bronze Age. It's something that we see over and over again in burials. It's one of the kind of best accesses we have in terms of the mortuary record, where, in other contexts, we're looking at texts where women are much harder to find, or we're looking at iconography where women are much more abstract. Bones are really great for that. And so motherhood is a really great way in. But then how does that make us see someone like Thetis, who has the role of a mother to play in the Iliad? How does that make us see her differently?
The historical roles for these women, you were connecting them to the Mycenaean period primarily.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I, should kind of begin with that broad caveat that, I'm absolutely not trying to say that that is the only era that Homer is looking back to, or indeed the primary era. Rather, what I was doing was I was taking the lead from the sense of pastness that pervades the epics, that sense of memory keeping that epic has as its central role, and trying to take the cue from that, the kind of dream reverie of a kind of bronze-clad society that pervades the epics, and use that as saying, okay, well, we're going to focus on a particular historical stratum, and that's going to be the late Bronze Age. How then does that make us read Homer differently? So if these are part of the beginnings of these tales that then trickle down over time, that obviously get mixed in with other historical contexts, what can we do by changing the directionality? And instead of starting from Homer, which is what everyone does when they're like, what period of history does Homer depict? They're always saying, well, what layer can we see in Homer? What layer can we see here and there? If we start with the history instead and say, how does that make us read Homer differently? Not only are we doing a different kind of historical reading, and I think probably more accurate in that we're not asking a text to be a historical source, but at the same time, we're also allowing the women to be our guides and to start the conversation as opposed to being the afterthought.
In what way did the research that you conducted for this book resemble the kind of research that you would have done when you wrote your trilogy of retellings of Greek myth?
It was really different. So the novels, I was also interested in the late Bronze Age, and I wanted to have a sense of a historical continuity, because I think that is important in any novel, in setting up a believable backdrop. And of course, this was something that, I was picking from myth and legend, but I wanted it to feel like it was set in a real time. For this book, I think because it was so led by new advances and what are we knowing now? What are we discovering now? What assumptions are we overturning? it was much more of a detective story in terms of how I was looking for things to research, because I was trying to find the unexpected, the places where, yeah, as I say, assumptions had been made around gender that are now being challenged, or places where we are simply at the frontiers of new knowledge with recently published papers and DNA. So I had to sort of throw myself in the deep end in terms of all of these different technologies that I had to sort of get my head around, and the archaeological digs. But for me, the reason that was so exciting was that it was saying Homer isn't a done and dusted story. These aren't just kind of myths and stories and texts that live in the past. What we can do is we can say, well, if we are interested in looking beyond these to the world that they were gesturing towards, and we can use ever new evidence to do that, then actually this is a continuing conversation, and there are more and more voices who get to be heard through that.
Well, it seems like in some ways there, in terms of the interest of the general readership, there are really great circumstances for you where there's this huge efflorescence of the feminist retellings that have been going on, which you have contributed to a great deal. But then also, Eric Cline made the late Bronze Age collapse very famous, and I think really brought to people's attention the absolutely staggering connectivity of that era. So could you maybe just say a little bit about the toolkit that you use to go about researching? Because you bring up a lot from the Hittite Empire, or you bring up a lot from ancient Egypt, and these obviously between the Minoans, or the so-called Minoans, so-called Mycenaeans. Again, they're all very interconnected. So how did you go about diving into that whole world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Eric Cline's books now were really influential for me in thinking about, how, first of all, how we might write a rigorous history that is still accessible. And secondly, how that narrative of interconnectivity and globalism, as well as, I think what he does really well is pulling out the resonances that this period has for us now. So yeah, I think there were so many different, and I think that for me, that notion of a toolkit was really at the front of my mind throughout. And that is a toolkit not only in the kinds of disciplines I was drawing on and the methodologies, but also the modes of writing. And that was something I was quite conscious of. So every chapter begins with a fiction opener. And for me, this was quite an important methodological statement, not just a sort of gesturing to the fact that we are seeing all of these retellings and reworkings, but actually that creativity does something really important for us in foregrounding particularly a woman's subjectivity, if you are talking about a woman who has not in the literature tended to have her experience put in the front. And so I really wanted to do that, to say, let's just for a moment inhabit this woman's world and her experience and allow her to have a voice. Then from that, moving into an archaeological discovery. Sometimes it's archaeology, sometimes it is a scientific discovery, so it's examination of DNA, or it is using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry to understand kind of the different compounds that are making up color. So all of those, I try and stage that discovery so that you feel that happening. So there is an element of fiction there. And again, this is now kind of writing style meeting the tools that I'm using, but that was quite conscious, that felt fast paced, that felt like you were engaged in that discovery. And then we move into kind of the more historical and literary discussion of the impact of that, how we read it as a historical discovery, how we understand where that slots in with Homer and the kind of themes I'm trying to eke out from Homer. So the tools are everything from kind of archaeology and, as you say, like multiple different empires, looking at the different textual traditions that they have. And obviously there are varying amounts of texts that we have from different civilizations, so you have to be agile there. Then looking at kind of scientific discoveries, looking particularly, another kind of strand to the book was an emphasis on female archaeologists, women historians, women scientists. So I really wanted to also be not just talking about foregrounding women in the past, but also demonstrating that this is a continuing conversation about women's discoveries often getting overlooked. And then sort of bringing fiction and my writing toolkit into the mix to try and make this the way I always think about it is that when we are dealing with voices that have been silenced in the archive or have been written out, then we need to be particularly flexible and we need to have a particularly wide range of tools in order to be able to try to address that. And that's what I was trying to bring with this book.
Well, I think that with the form of it, it's a really interesting and powerful methodological statement, because so much of the scholarship that one, especially, the older scholarship that one reads about Homer, or if you read these kind of earlier books written sort of shortly after the decipherment of Linear B, there is actually so much fiction in the narratives, but people are just not, the scholars just don't tend to be open about it. That so much of what they're writing down and presenting as fact really is the product of imaginations, very active imaginations. I mean, particularly in the case of these Mycenaean palaces, where it's almost, I was talking with a friend a couple of weeks ago about how it's these loops of, it's like almost like they were able to imagine what they were looking for and then somehow manifest them from the ground, and then have the people who did the reconstructions and the restorations, mold them to their imaginations of what these objects were. I mean, that's for another podcast. Anyways, but I guess what I'm saying is I think that it's really powerful that you lean into fiction as a tool, and as you were saying, the writer's craft as a way of accessing these women from the standpoints that you're interested in, and that you're making statements about. So I think that's really exciting, and I do want to come back to that. But given all that, given how much you're bringing together in terms of fields and forms in this book, I'm curious what the audience you had in your head was. Like, who were you speaking to in your head as you were writing this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I very much had a public audience in my mind. I was not thinking of this as a scholarly book. I think in part that freedom to move between different forms is part and parcel of that for me. The fact that I could mix fiction in, the fact that I could mix staged discoveries, all of that felt like part of that loosening of speaking towards a more public audience. At the same time, yeah, you're absolutely right that there is a lot going on. I kind of hope that for someone who might be accessing this material for the first time, my aim was to make it as accessible as possible, make no assumptions about prior knowledge, but lay everything out before them. And someone who might have familiarity with what I'm doing would understand a little bit more and have a little bit more awareness of what I'm doing in terms of playing with all of these different tools. But if you don't know, you don't need to, because what I'm doing is interlocking a jigsaw of different pieces of evidence in front of you, and you just kind of go along for the ride. Now, obviously, at the point where someone is a Homerist or they are a late Bronze Age archaeologist and they want to think about, well, why are you taking this piece of evidence? How is that working for you? I think it can operate on that level. But my hope is that it doesn't have to, that it could just be an entry point into both these incredible poems, these incredible epics, but also the tapestry of civilizations and cultures and histories that lie behind them.
Could I ask, just because I think it's always interesting to hear, if you'd be willing to pull the curtain back a little bit on the pitch process, like how did you package this for publishers or your agent, or what was the sell? Just because it is such a striking combination of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very much what you were saying earlier about the fact that we have had this incredible upswing in Greek myth retellings. I think publishers are always thinking about what the market is, what the reception is going to be for a particular topic. And so I think broadly having an audience who is interested in women's retellings of Greek myths in fiction meant that I could say, look, there are people who are interested in this, but what they're not getting is someone who has given them an actual kind of history of this, and not just the history, but also a little bit of the texts, a little bit of the myths. So it essentially is what I was kind of pitching it as, what I was thinking of was, there are so many people who are getting into this material. Would there be a way where I could show them that actually sometimes the history can be as fun as the fiction, and that we can dive deep into this material, there are fascinating things to discover and pull on that interest and say, well, hey, let's look at this in history too. And I think that's what for the publishers was really attractive. It was sort of, well, let's turn this around. Let's say, yes, we've got the women in the Greek myths, but what are the real women doing?
Yeah, well, I think, it's a very smart move from that perspective as well, just because, now anyone who approaches any retelling can use this book as a kind of guide. I mean, you have a really full apparatus with the bibliography, suggestions for further reading, the glossary, which I think people, even who are mostly interested in the fictional tellings will find really useful. But if we bring it back to the Homer a little bit, one of the things that I'm curious about is, and I'm genuinely curious about this, is to what extent do you think that the poems really have silenced these women or treated the women substantially different in terms of the richness and texture of their characterizations differently than the male characters? So you start with a gesture to the, Mary Beard's famous argument about the beginning of, whatever she calls Western literature or something, with Penelope being silenced by Telemachus. Yeah, okay. But I guess I'm just wondering, how textured do you think the Homeric poems themselves are? Or how deep are they, or nuanced in terms of their treatments of women, and how substantially, with, let's say, like the examples of Odysseus and Achilles taken away, how substantially different are they from the treatments of the men?
Yeah, so I think there are two important things there. One is, that it's interesting that, you're sort of like, let's take away Odysseus and Achilles, because obviously, like, it's sort of, the Iliad is the poem of Achilles, the Odyssey is the poem of Odysseus. If we take them away, then okay, we're on a much more even footing. But but the other thing I think that immediately I want to say, and I was very careful to try to do in the book as well, is that I don't see the women in Homer as two-dimensional or as flattened or as consistently silenced at all. In fact, to me, one of the reasons I think I keep coming back to these poems is because there is an incredible richness and texture to the female characters, and that they are dialoguing with the male characters in ways that deepen the poem and the poem's meaning. What I mean by it is more that it is the part of the narrative engine to me of the Homeric epics. And indeed, I actually think that this broadens out to Greek literature more broadly, but, we could talk about that another time. But I think the tension, the energy of tension in women being recognized as being creative and interesting three-dimensional forces in their own right, and at the same time, the sociocultural forces which then operate on them to silence them or to sideline or to marginalize them. And you see that happening again and again in the poems, where you see a woman perhaps slightly step forward and then move back, step forward and move back. And it's that tension, that energy, that dynamism that to me actually is the engine of the poems. It for me, that is what characterizes the quarrel over Briseis and Chryseis at the beginning of the Iliad. It's a moment where women's value is becoming so central to the men that actually it's threatening to cave in the entire operation. And then you see that mirrored again where Thetis goes to Zeus, and we have this subliminal reference to her power that she once rescued him. Though there is this latent reference to Thetis's threat to Zeus. But the point is, it's always latent. The point is, it's always subdued. It's always controlled. And I think that paradox, that tension, is what I wanted to eke out here.
Was there any struggle to picking which women you were going to include? I mean, there are the obvious ones, I suppose. Yeah. But were there any that didn't make it in, I guess, is the question I really want to ask, that you had toyed with? That didn't, make the varsity cut?
Yeah. No, it's really tricky because, when I give talks about the book and I'm kind of like, I include all of the women. And then I always have to stop myself and be like, well, it's not all of them. It's as many as I can put in. So the obvious ones who I was unhappy not to have in, but I ultimately reconciled with myself because I felt that they became part of a wider chapter, was Melantho and the enslaved women in the Odyssey from Penelope's court. And for me, they come, and I try to make the chapter that is titled Eurycleia, I try to make that about all of them. So in that sense, there is a sense that they are there. There were other women who didn't make it. Ino from the Odyssey, who I would have really liked to have had in, but, I just was like, I'm not sure I can make her into an entire chapter. And then, yeah, there is some sort of interesting side characters who you see mentioned, but I feel like I managed to get the ones who, because, as much as the primary aim of this was to draw back the curtain on women's histories and women's experiences in the late Bronze Age, I'm also a philologist, I'm also a Homerist. And so for me, it was also about finding the women who are important to the narrative economies of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in that sense, I think I felt that I'd done them justice. At least I hope so.
Which of the chapters maybe do you remember most the writing process, whether for the difficulty or for the, I don't know, sentimental attachment you got, or for the degree of shock that you experienced when you came upon material that was new?
Well, without a doubt, it's the Thetis chapter, the chapter about motherhood. I had, at this point, fairly young children. I'd become a mother a couple of years beforehand, and I think that this would have been a deeply emotive chapter to write in any case if I didn't also have that personal experience, because the shock of what women went through, I think the revelation of the kind of the direness of what the expectations were for women in labor and childbirth were extraordinary to me. I had no idea that it was as bad as it turned out to be from the evidence. But I think then also when you tie that together with the fact that this is an experience that I was also having, and that that women across the millennia have had, it created for me a kind of shared and widening impact, a sense of solidarity. And then, of course, there was just the fact that it is incredibly, incredibly sad. And so when I read the audiobook for the book, and when I was reading the Thetis chapter, there were real moments where I sort of was like, I kind of need to take a pause, because, it's heavy stuff. Yeah.
Well, would you be so kind as to read some of it for us?
Yeah, of course. Tissues at the ready. I guess we were given the warning, but yeah, no, of course. I'll do sort of the opening of the Thetis chapter. So as we said before, it begins with a little bit of fiction. We then move into some archaeology, and then we'll dive into Homer. She cannot get away from being a mother. She shifts shape. It's her gift. From flecks of water to face-melting flame. She can pour from the mould of a goddess into the slick dripping maw of a lion and out again. But she is never not a mother. She can slide and stretch into different skins, but she cannot escape the stretch marks from that one terrifying transformation. She remembers the jagged pain when that other shape plunged into her, how her body distended though she hadn't tried to change, how the contours of her skin stretched and bulged, strange lumps in her abdomen, elbows, heels, driving like stakes into her inner organs. And she remembers the lunging and tearing as the labour pains took hold, how her body shook and sweat poured, and she wished her bones would melt and she could be free of this blood and body chain. And then he slipped out, tiny, warm, folded into blankets with the smallest, pinkest nails like shells. And the terror of her exhausted love for him was too much. Fragile as driftwood, warm as sand. And as they cut the cord and blood splashed round her thighs, she wanted to lay her body down on him, like the waves wrapping the shore, and never let him go. The bones, small and delicate as a bird's, emerged from the sieve, soaked and shining with water, trailing a smear of mud. Archaeologist Anaya Sapaki has been bent over in the lab, painstakingly sifting the soil lifted from the shallow pit, running it through the mesh with a hose to extract the minutest of organic remains. Now she feels the bits of grit slip between her fingers and fumbles for the mud-flecked pieces of the human puzzle that are beginning to surface in the rush of water. Flakes of skull, then ear bones the size of drawing pins, 12 ivory teeth, and 10 miniature toes. She cradles them in her hands as the water slooshes through her fingers, clear and vital as amniotic fluid. And she knows that she is holding a baby. It's autumn 2014, and the pastel-splashed harbour of the city of Chania, ancient Koulonia, in Crete, is returning to its warm, languid hum, the odd musician plucking a bouzouki, and locals dipping beneath the awnings of red and ochre shops as the summer's tourists drain away. The team of archaeologists has been digging here since the 1970s at the Aya Casarini Square, up behind the harbour, in a quiet tree-lined plaza. Stone walls run over each other in a dusty maze across the reddish earth, interspersed with scattered paving slabs from a prehistoric courtyard and half-formed runs of staircases. And it's in one forgotten corner, by a wall behind the crumbling remains of a sprawling townhouse from the late Minoan city of Koulonia, that the team have unearthed 3 soil-blackened stone slabs, covering the grave of a baby boy. Birth would have been a terrifying and highly dangerous undertaking in the Bronze Age world, for mother and child alike. In one especially dismal prehistoric settlement in mainland Greece, over half of the 100 children buried there had died in the first month of their life. Not far from the baby at Koulonia, another infant burial, this time of a premature fetus, 37 weeks old, was discovered under the floor of a domestic area for the preparation of food. Struggling through pregnancy and birth to give life to children who died was a woman's reality until very recently. But I don't think that would have made it any less raw, any less searingly painful. To treat these burials like neat pen markers that allow us to map cultural change takes away the traumatic and heartrending loss to a mother that each and every one represents. Scouring the red-brown earth across the Aegean world, the graves of the lost newborns and infants gouged out of the floors of family homes and stitched back up again, each stand for their own pockmark of terrible loss and longing. Tucked up in baskets, as if they were sleeping, wrapped in blankets, as if their mothers longed to keep them warm, nestled with the toys they never used and the clay baby feeders they would never need again. What would it have been like to live with an infant who was of the world, but not in it, under the paving slab, slapped by the soles of your children's feet, knowing every day that your baby boy was there? Would that have been a source of comfort, or an unrelenting, unforgettable pain? The Iliad, Homer's so-called epic of war, is consumed by the gut-wrenching anguish of a mother learning to live with her grief for her son. And it is she, veiled and cloaked in black, and the grief she can't forget, as Homer puts it, who brings the poem to its close. Just as Helen starts the Trojan War and Briseis and Chryseis initiate the conflict of Homer's war epic, it is another powerful and powerfully sidelined woman, a mother, who stands behind every twist and turn in the Iliadic story, who propels and directs this supposed tale of heroes all the way from the opening book to the last, who realises the desires of the epic's greatest warrior, and who is, in many dark and untapped ways, mightier than the king of the gods himself. Her name is Thetis, and she is the mother of a boy, Achilles.
Hearing you read that, I wonder, because I mean, you have such a powerful voice of a writer. Going back again to your experience writing fiction, the novelizations, the novelistic accounts of Greek mythology, I'm wondering if there were points in your research for this book that really shocked you. If I had written 3 novels about anything, I would think, okay, I've got a hang of this material. It would be hard to surprise me. But as you were taking this more historical approach, what really stopped you in your tracks and made you think, oh, wow, I just hadn't thought of it like that?
I love that question. And I think that the answer to that is precisely the fact that you're looking at the same thing in a different way, that in many ways it was everything, because you're almost more surprised because it's something that you think you know and that you perhaps have become complacent about, or you feel familiar with, or you think you've got a handle on. I think for me, it was the moments where, first of all, I was able to learn new skills. And for me, that's always exciting. I think, learning new knowledge, understanding how chemical compounds can be split apart to understand what's going on in there, and that we can kind of use that as a way to look back at the past and what compounds they were using in various pots. That was super exciting, and it opened up a whole new world to me. But the moments I think that really, particularly engagement with Homer, were moments of revelation, were moments where I think history allowed the more prosaic side of things to come through, and that challenged the fantasy and the literariness and the mythology that tends to swirl around these women. So the examples that really like drew me in were someone like Calypso, who I'd always had a problem with, and I knew I had a problem with her from a perspective of the way that she is interpreted both within Homer by Odysseus, and also how scholars tend to interpret her, where the conversation is always around her being a restraint to Odysseus, being a jailer, being a temptation, all of this kind of language being used and getting in the way of his journey home, stopping his Odyssey. And to me, that had always felt problematic, because I sort of thought, well, the Odyssey hasn't stopped at this point. If anything, where Calypso comes in, the Odyssey has started. Calypso has been generative to the narrative in that she has created an impetus for the narrative to begin. Now, of course, the Odyssey might have stopped in terms of the voyage, but the Odyssey in terms of the epic has opened with Calypso. So I always had issues with that. But I think it was the moment where I kind of moved away from my literary scholar hat and actually was just like, okay, like what is happening here? What is happening on the ground? Odysseus leaves with a raft and a sail. Who has given him that sail? It has to be Calypso. How long does it take her to weave that sail? And then you look into the archaeology and all of the exciting stuff that contemporary experimental archaeologists are doing, and you realize that not only is a sail the largest textile that they had in the ancient world, not only is Homer telling us that Calypso is a weaver, because we see her doing that in Book 5 of the Odyssey, but also it would have taken multiple years for a single woman to spin and weave a sail. And I think there was something to me that was so appealing about the kind of prosaic nature of that moves us away from her as a wily, sexy temptress and turns her, in fact, into a woman who is just trying to get the job done. And to me, I think that was one of the things that was really exciting about the way that archaeology turned Homer on his head for me.
Yeah, I guess if he wanted to sail with a sail, he did have to wait 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing. And it completely changes the narrative, because then, she is being imprisoned by the substantial labor that he has imposed upon her, right? It's a completely different conversation.
Yeah, it does strike me that Poseidon as this narrative blocking figure is, I think, valorized. It's, his wrath is keeping Odysseus from home, and that's epic and interesting and sort of sublime. But then Calypso, herself is a blocking agent. She's just painted exactly as you were saying. It's like, kind of a drag.
Yeah.
Who, is not letting him get out of the house.
But what's most fascinating about it, in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised, should we? Because first of all, the way that you think about kind of what the narrative is doing, the narrative has a desire, and I'm really interested in teleology. So, from a teleological perspective, there is the Nostos needs to happen, the return home needs to happen. So Calypso is a problem, and she's a problem both for Homer and for Odysseus. So from within the text, in some ways, it's not a surprise that she is being figured as a restraint and a constraint. What I think is really interesting is that then gets picked up in what scholarship tends to say about Calypso. That doesn't get examined. That is actually a feature of the narrative desire to write Odysseus's tale and not her tale.
You were speaking about some of these new technologies that you were encountering as you were doing the research for this book. And there is, every so often there are headlines about discoveries, whether through new techniques of datation or DNA analysis, oftentimes around human remains. What do you think these kinds of technologies, like the DNA analysis, what light do they really shed on things? Because they are controversial. What does it add to think that we know in some detail what a person of this era looked like?
Yeah. I think that's a really important point. And I think also that there is a tendency to sort of see DNA and think sort of shiny and new and therefore must have something interesting to say. And I really tried to resist that, in that I was always trying to think, what is this telling me about a woman's story and about a woman's historical experience, and how can I unpack that to then make it say something, rather than just saying DNA and then being like, okay, job done. I've said DNA. So, one of the examples that I think works well for this is Andromache, because Andromache is, I'm talking about her, using her as a kind of figure for the wife. And I wanted to talk about women as wives. And my initial kind of way in was to think through the Linear B texts. I think as a classicist, I tend to turn to text first. And so that was my first thought. And there are a couple of wives who we have listed on the Linear B texts from Pylos. I think there's only like 6. We get their names. We get that one has the possession of a pair of sandals, and that's about it. And there wasn't much to do with that. And in some ways, there is probably a story there to be told, in that is telling you something about women's status and what it means to be a wife. But I kind of thought, well, what can I do that's different or that's new? And there was this really interesting DNA paper that had just come out at that point that was looking at DNA and a sort of hidden part within DNA that tells us about consanguinity, which is about the relatedness of parents. And that therefore allows us, from a single individual's DNA, to understand how closely related their parents were, and therefore to kind of reconstruct marriage customs. And for me, that then became really interesting, because I was like, okay, look, here's a new technology, but here it is that it is actually telling us something about something that is social and something that is cultural that you were seeing reflected in DNA. And to me, that then became really exciting. Now, one of the findings, they were looking at multiple different areas, but one of their areas of focus was this consanguinity of marriage. And they were finding that there were a significant number of first cousin marriages in this time in the Aegean. And to me, that was interesting immediately as a Homerist, because you do get a couple of kind of close family marriages in the fantasy world of the Odyssey. And then I started to think, right, so how do we think about unions among families? How do we think about metaphorical unions? Of course, when Andromache talks about Hector being her mother and her father and her husband and her brother, how is she using that idea of family as marriage, and then taking that kind of to demonstrate how she has lost everything, right? So not suggesting that she has actually married her brother, but rather that the closeness of that relationship is being used to figure her sense of loss. So that just became a really interesting way in.
Yeah, I mean, that's, of course, then what sets up all of these cursed families, right? When it really is all in the family.
Yeah, we haven't got to Greek tragedy yet. Yeah,
right. Well, you mentioned Calypso and looking into the technology of weaving, and you just mentioned, I guess, what we could loosely file as, Mycenaean kinship structures. In another life, or in another academic life, I would be a specialist in Mycenaean painting, which you discuss very beautifully under the rubric of daughter. Which of these disparate or interlinked, but kind of disparate pockets, I guess, of what we could call Mycenaean studies, or did you find most compelling? Is there one that you think that maybe you'll go back to? Is there some area, or which really kind of led you down, the garden path?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's amazing that you kind of would have done Mycenaean iconography. I didn't know that, that there was an interest there for you. It's funny that you say that, because I personally have always found iconography the most difficult. I think because I understand how to read text. I understand how to read the layers and the kind of symbols. And I think I don't speak the language of paintings and iconography. And so for me, there was a learning curve there to kind of understand how to do that. But that has I don't think that would be where I would say my fascination goes. For me, one of the things that I really loved was learning about underwater archaeology and the Uluburun shipwreck. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is just something about, so I was super lucky. And when I was 17, just before I started university, I did a couple of summers digging in Pompeii. And Pompeii is just such an unusual site as something that was preserved, left by and large, apart from looting, and then we kind of find it again. It's got that time capsule feel to it. And I think it was the underwater archaeology that had that similar feel to me when I was exploring that shipwreck, this late Bronze Age shipwreck that literally had gone down in about 1320 BCE and had stayed there undiscovered at the bottom of the seabed, a whole cargo, the amount of reconstruction you can do on that. And that was just, again, where I just got really nerdy about these new technologies. I can't believe the kinds of stuff they can do when they were basically tracing where this ship had gone, and they, the amount of detail that they went into in that excavation, and finding a jawbone of a Syrian house mouse. Not only that they found it, like, think of the challenges of the archaeology that they were doing, but then that they identified it and then could work out that it had stopped in a Syrian port, likely Ugarit, and that the mouse had come on board there. To me, that was just incredibly exciting. It's like detective work. And I think it's that combination of finding something that is pristinely preserved from the past and then the kind of detective work that you do to unravel it that I found boundlessly exciting.
Yeah, the shipwrecks are, I think, general, their chronopoetics, or whatever you might want to call it, are really totally exciting. I'm really rather curious about, now having written this book, if quite honestly you might be a little bit sick of these women, or if you feel like it maybe got you excited to return to some fiction now, maybe having looked at them in a different light. What do you think? I'm not going to be so indiscreet as to ask necessarily what's next, but I guess I'm wondering what you see for the future in terms of how this book will shape how you think about fiction, and whether you want to return to it specifically around this kind of material.
I think it's an important question, and it's one I've mulled over, specifically because I think if you look at, obviously everything is always kind of clearer with hindsight, right? But I feel that it's kind of, looking at this, it's kind of obvious that this is where I ended up, in that, I started with the fiction. I then went into the kind of scholarship, academic nonfiction. And this is kind of bringing those two sides together. It's sort of that fictional and that kind of hopefully accessible way of presenting the past, combined with kind of deep historical rigor. Now, the question is, as you say, kind of where next, once you've kind of mixed those two. For me, there are kind of several different avenues. I think I have never closed the door on fiction. And so I think that is definitely always there in my mind and in my heart. At the same time, I think what was so exciting about doing this book was that feeling of doing something new and bringing together different methodologies in a way that I didn't feel had been done before. And I think that there are ways that this could be extended. There are ways that this could be perhaps theorized. I think it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about imagination. And, I'm the first to say that there are real dangers in using your imagination when it comes to archaeology and history, if you let it go too far. But when it's done responsibly, when it's done consciously, conscientiously, what are the things that we can do with it? And to me, that feels exciting, sort of pressing there and saying, how could we break down these boundaries, these different toolkits? Even the fact that, do we have to put this book into the public facing or into the academic bucket? Like, can it not also be both? Why are we distinguishing those two? I think for me, it feels like there is some big thinking to be done there. I don't know which direction it goes in, but to me, that's exciting.
Do you think that you will return to the history of the Mycenaean period?
I think it's not unlikely. I think there was, for me, it was such a voyage of personal discovery, in that it was a period that I had not had particular interest in. I certainly was not interested in it in undergrad when we covered it. And I think one of the reasons that I hope the book reads excitingly is because I was kind of falling in love with this period as I was writing it and as I was discovering it. And so, I don't think I'm ready to let it go. I don't know what form that takes, but I definitely feel like I opened up something completely new. Yeah.
And not to ask you to prognosticate or anything, but, you were talking about the audience that there is now for what I guess just usually gets called feminist retellings of Greek mythology. And there's, some big ones about to come out. Natalie Haynes has her retelling of the Medea story coming out soon. Where do you see this trend going? Do you think that there is room for more? Do you think that the market is saturated? What do you think is going to happen in this arena?
Yeah, it's an important question. So I think that there is certainly room for more. I think that actually one of the things that I find quite difficult and damaging is that the conversation has tended in the last few years to go quite quickly. I think particularly in publishing, to sort of conversations around saturation or ends of trends or these kinds of things, which I think is a really difficult thing, not least because myths and mythical retellings by men have had millennia of mileage in them. So I think the idea that feminist retellings get like a decade and then they're done, I think is really something that we need to challenge. And I think a lot of authors are challenging in really interesting ways, demonstrating that there are new things to be said. The incredible thing about myth, and this is why I think that this is happening now and why it's happening so successfully, is that it is incredibly flexible. It can be, you could have two people tell the same quote unquote myth and they can do such interesting and vital different things with it. I mean, you gave the example of Natalie Haynes's Medea. Rosie Hewlett wrote a Medea last year. And, I think there is always going to be space for different ones. So that to me isn't a concern. I think if anything, I would urge people to resist the inner narrative that there must be an end to this. I think more broadly, one of the things that I think that will help this to grow and will be an important and beneficial thing is if perhaps we move beyond Greek myth to a wider and more diverse palette of myths and legends and cultural stories. And I think we're already seeing this, and I think that's really welcome. But, my tendency is often to ask, like, why does it just have to be Greek? Now, for me, I understand my reasoning is that this is kind of where I position my work. But I think that challenging ourselves to go wider and looking at other cultures can only be a good thing. So I think that if you look at that there is exponential room to grow.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I'm hoping that you will be up for the traditional podcast closing game of word association.
Absolutely.
I'm very excited to hear your takes on these. So I will just read out a couple of words or phrases, and if you just say the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Don't overthink it. So the first one is Homer.
Oh, gosh. I guess, what's really funny is I had a mental image of a jigsaw puzzle. And that's because when I teach Homer, I have a slide that tries to explain all of the different movements, and that's one of them for the analysts. So yeah, I just had a jigsaw puzzle.
That's great. That's great. The next is, let's say, Thetis.
Images of her dipping Achilles into the Styx. Again, it's very imagistic. It's interesting.
Yeah, you said you don't really do Achilles.
No, I know. I'm surprising myself.
Feminist retelling.
Yeah, again, I get an image of a pile of the myth retelling books.
Calypso.
Sail. That's an easy one.
And finally, Muse.
Oh, interesting. The thing that came to my mind was voice. Because I am vexed by the muses that they never get a voice. And when they do get a voice in Hesiod, it's his voice, not their voice. And so what I would love would be for the muses to have their own voice.
Thank you, Emily, so much for agreeing to do the podcast. Congratulations on the beautiful book, all the deserved success of it. It's really something different and exciting. And I'm glad that you're here for a summer episode because I think it would be great summer reading for our listeners. So thank you so very much for all of these things.
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you so much for having me and for your brilliant questions. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.